Worst dictators of the world. Here's a look at some of the most cruel dictators that the world has ever seen, and you will not believe the demonic things that happened during their time. Number 1. Kim Il-sung the Tyrant. The North has been under the dictatorship of Kim Il-sung since 1948, who gave North Korea a cult-like personality. With the Soviet Union's support, Kim converted the nation into a prison of terror and the unchallenged rule of an individual in which millions of its population lived in constant fear. His cult of personality destroyed people's identity and transformed the country into an Orwellian society. The Korean War, a stage for massacre.
Meanwhile, it was decided that the 7th United States Infantry Division, which had been on occupation duty and undergoing training in Japan's snow-covered northern region, would constitute one major ground unit of the invasion force.
The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, is an example of Kim's brutal nature. Government employees, anti-communists, and citizens at large were among thousands of whom Northern Korean forces killed. Almost endless slaughter of POWs, up to 12,000 South Koreans and 6,000 Americans, were executed or starved to death. Originally, some 500,000 civilians were massacred during the war based on his instructions. Prisoner transfer camps and death facilities. People were dying from starvation, tortured, and executed by prisoners. In these camps alone, nearly 707,000 people were reported to have perished by 1987, and close to 1 million more in extermination through forced hard labor projects. A legacy of terror. During Kim's regime, an estimated 3.5 million lost their lives in the purges and executions, including political prisoners and forced starvation. The actual dimensions of evil of his deeds would never be ascertained. His rule stands out to this day as the most blood-soaked episode ever known. Number 2. Pol Pot, founder of Cambodia's darkest hour.
A
revolution was slowly brewing in the heart of Southeast Asia under the leadership of one man who would refer to himself as Brother Number 1. Pol Pot was actually a namesake, born Saloth Sar in 1925. From a peaceful rural home, he rose to orchestrate one of the most horrific genocides in history, turning his vision of a classless, agrarian paradise into a Cambodian nightmare, killing nearly a quarter of the population between 1975 and 1979. The pathway to authority. Pol Pot was born in a quaint rural village in Cambodia. A gifted student, he journeyed to France in the early 1950s, where he embraced communist ideologies. Upon his return in 1953, he melded Stalinist and Maoist principles with a vision of agrarian purity. With the support of rural Cambodians, North Vietnamese forces, and assistance from China, he guided the Khmer Rouge to power in 1975, following years of civil strife. When Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge seized power, it sealed the end of the Cambodian Civil War and was the start of a genocide. Cities were left empty because millions were compelled to be transferred to the countryside and made to labor in extremely brutish conditions. Intellectuals, ethnic minorities, and anyone seen as a threat were systematically hunted. The genocide progressed. Pol Pot dreamed of a totally transformed Cambodia. The city folk were sent to the countryside and spent many hours digging canals and tilling the land. Gross mismanagement of resources by the Khmer Rouge resulted in widespread famine and disease that took hundreds of thousands of lives. Under Pol Pot, Cambodia's economy collapsed and its people were reduced to little more than laboring pawns in his vision of purity. Disease and starvation became widespread, with the total death toll estimated at 1.5 to 3 million, almost 1 in 4 Cambodians. Fall of Tyrant. The invasion of Vietnam finally ended the brutal regime of the Khmer Rouge in 1979 and led to the overthrow of Pol Pot's rule. However, Pol Pot evaded justice for nearly 2 decades. hiding in the jungles of Cambodia, unrepentant and unpunished for his crimes against humanity, until he finally died in 1998, a legacy of suffering like no other. This brings to mind Pol Pot's Cambodia, how low humanity can sink. He wished to build a new nation, but at the price of millions lost and a shattered society. Number 3. Hideki Tojo, the militarist behind Japan's expansionism.
He was the leader of Japan who brought his nation from active conflict with China to global war in 1941. But he was not, as he is sometimes portrayed, an authoritarian dictator like his ally Adolf Hitler.
Tojo was born in 1884 to a military family. Thus, discipline and loyalty towards the Japanese Empire defined his life. He proved outstanding in military school and climbed through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army. During this period, he developed the reputation of a hardliner committed unconditionally to Japan's imperial ambitions. In 1940, Tojo was made Minister of War. By 1941, he became the Prime Minister of Japan. He thus came to hold control over the two spheres, political and military. Tojo's vision, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Tojo was appointed as Prime Minister by Emperor Hirohito, the traditional way, in October 1941. But there were no constitutional changes made that solidified or extended his power. He was not the leader of any mass popular movement, and there aren't any real ideologies you associate him with. He didn't have anything like total power, even holding multiple offices and cabinet posts simultaneously. And though he was both army minister and prime minister, he certainly did not control the Japanese Navy, and the war with the Western powers being fought across the Pacific Ocean meant the Navy being pretty important.
Under Tojo, Japan invaded territories in Southeast Asia that included China, the Philippines, Malaya, and Indonesia. He planned strategically so that he was able to attack Pearl Harbor directly in 1941, which involved the United States in the war. This was a turning point of World War II, raising the level of intensity in the conflict to a global level. Atrocities under Tojo's rule. Tojo's tenure was marred by widespread atrocities committed by Japanese forces. Although Tojo was not the prime minister then, his policies were the military approach that paved the way for this massacre, in which hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians lost their lives and thousands of women were violated. Forced labor and starvation. The compulsion of forced labor forced millions to work in the occupied regions, while hundreds of thousands were starved due to their exploitative policies. Tojo rationalized these actions as essential for the preservation and dominance of Japan, exemplifying the resolute militarism that defined his administration. The collapse of Hideki Tojo.
The trial of Japan's war leaders ends in Tokyo. Admiral Shimada, Japan's Pearl Harbor Navy minister, hears his sentence.
Accused Shimada Shigetaro, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to imprisonment for life.
After Japan's surrender in 1945, Tojo was captured by the Allied forces. He attempted to commit suicide but survived and was put on trial for war crimes at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. He was given sentences for several charges, including waging aggressive war and ordering cruel treatment of prisoners. He was given a death sentence and executed in 1948. Number 4. Leopold II, accounting for Belgium's colonial past.
When Leopold of the Belgians went to Congo, he found a society that was organized in the middle of one of the richest places God ever created. And he claimed Congo as his personal property. This we never say. Initially, what is now Congo, which later became a colony of Belgium.
Leopold II considered his claim to the Congo in 1885, shrouded in promises of humanitarian aid, but rather going around, marketing his control over a huge area of 2 million kilometers as a philanthropic mission. The regime instead was founded on terror and forced labor. The Congo Free State was a rubber for profit, and ivory was to be marshaled out of the region. Colonial administrators implemented ruthless quotas, punishing those who failed to meet them with mutilation, torture, and murder. Photographic evidence from the era documents atrocities, such as dismembered limbs of enslaved Congolese, acts of retribution against those who resisted. While historians debate the exact death toll, estimates suggest Leopold's rule caused the deaths of up to 10 million Congolese people through killings, starvation, disease, and brutal labor conditions. Belgium's colonial amnesia, international condemnation in the form of assuming control by the Belgian government, came in 1908. Nonetheless, this does not deny that Leopold II was to be found later in the 20th century as a patron of infrastructure, architecture, and modernization. Across Belgium, statues dedicated to Leopold became part of a sanitized story surrounding his legacy. This amnesia about Leopold's atrocities persisted for decades, with little education or public discussion about the true nature of his colonial rule. The present reckoning. Belgium's colonial past has been becoming an issue of growing concern and demand for eliciting public concern. Protests around the globe in 2020 over the death of George Floyd also brought pressure on authorities in Belgium to put demands into action. As a sign of boycott, some statues linked with King Leopold II were vandalized, painted red to represent blood, or best overthrown. According to activists, these statues glorify racist and exploitative history. The Belgian government has started taking steps toward this past. Education reform. Since 2021, Belgium has incorporated colonial history into secondary school curriculums.
It's an apology an entire generation was waiting for. Belgium's Prime Minister, Charles Michel, apologized to mixed-race children who were kidnapped during the country's colonial rule.
In 2019, then Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel apologized over the kidnapping of mixed-race children from Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. However, there has never been an official apology for these more general crimes of colonial rule. The controversy over statues. Statues carry symbolic power. To many, their presence in public spaces represents an unfinished legacy of racism and colonial violence. Taking them down is merely the first step toward reconciliation and change. Opinions on what should be done with the statues of Leopold II vary. Activists suggest that the statues be transferred to museums, where they would be used to educate people. Others, like Prince Laurent of Belgium, hold that Leopold II cannot be blamed since he never stepped foot in Congo, a view widely condemned. But there is no dictator like the next one right here. Number 5. Adolf Hitler, Germany's dark passenger. Adolf Hitler's legacy is forever marked by one of history's most horrific genocides. His regime orchestrated the systematic extermination of millions of innocent lives, driven by an ideology of extreme nationalism, Aryan racial superiority, and deep anti-Semitism. The Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were killed, is the most notorious crime of this era. However, the Nazi genocide encompasses much more than the Jews and reaches out to an entire spectrum of victims: the Roma, Gypsies, Slavs, disabled people, political dissidents, and many more who were classified as inferior by the regime. Nazi policies killed an estimated 20,946,000 between 1933 and 1945. The number is a staggering indicator of the unimaginable horror that spread throughout Europe. The genocide did not only consist of executions or mass shootings, it also reflected forced labor, starvation, disease, medical experiments, and terror bombing. People were butchered mercilessly in atrocious ways, machine-gunned in batches, suffocated in gas chambers, starved to death in concentration camps, and executed for their race, religion, or political beliefs. The Nazis perpetrated a very cold-blooded regime. The groups destroyed comprised professional, intellectual, and leadership groups in the societies, especially in Eastern Europe. It is unbearable to look at the death toll in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. In these countries, whole populations were liquidated. Nazis killed approximately 2 million people in Poland, 3 million people in Ukraine, and more than 1.5 million Russians. In some regions, 1 civilian in 6 was killed. For each German soldier, 100 people were executed as civilians. All the villages would be destroyed, with men, women, and children being taken away to death, all in the name of control and fear. Under these genocidal policies, the Nazis' brutal and meticulous extermination was justified through a demented belief in the superiority of the Aryan race. Hitler and his followers saw Jews, Roma, Slavs, and others as actual obstacles to the idealized, racially pure society that they envisioned. Not only did these groups have enemies to vanquish, but also diseases that needed to be eradicated for their greater vision of the future. However, the genocide went beyond the racial theories they had developed. It reached down to those who might question their authority: political opponents, critics, pacifists, conscientious objectors, not to mention thousands of Germans opposed to the Nazi regime, who were executed or deported to concentration camps. The horrors of the scale of genocide committed by them are unimaginable. Together, it has been estimated that the Nazis managed to kill a staggering 20,946,000 people, a figure far outstripping the staggering losses sustained in war combat. This was one of the most telling examples of how ideologies can lead to the complete and unrelenting, destructively dehumanizing of people, and one of the darkest pages in human history. Not only was this a war to destroy the body, but it was also a great blow to humanity and the living itself. No wound ever healed by the Nazi regime inflicted such scars on the world today as to make its remembrance a sine qua non to stop such atrocities from recurring. So, who among these men do you think was the worst? Who else would you add to this list? Don't forget to mention in the comments below. And if you like this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.